Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Build Stuff 2021, our hybrid event running online and offline. Hello to all the folks out there in Vilnius watching us on the big cinema screens. Good to see you all. Hello to all of you out there on the internet watching us on your desktop, your mobile, your laptop, maybe even some of you out there watching us on the big screen TV to get some of that cinema experience. Great to see all of you out there as well. Our next speaker is a senior developer advocate with AWS. Please give a big warm welcome, joining us here on the Build Stuff stage to talk about building serverless multi-tenant SaaS applications, Gunnar Grosch.
Thank you very much, Dylan, and hi, everyone. So Dylan introduced me. I'm Gunnar Grosch. I work for AWS as a developer advocate, and I'm based in Sweden, covering normally the Nordics and Baltics. So happy to be with you today. And yeah, we're going to look at how to build serverless multi-tenant SaaS applications. And normally that takes a lot more than 45 minutes, so it's going to be a quick one, but I hope you are buckled up and let's get to it. So sorry about that. There we go. So we're going to start about the fundamental goal with building multi-tenant SaaS. And first off, tenant isolation. It is really a fundamental part of designing and development of SaaS systems. It enables SaaS providers to reassure customers that even in a multi-tenant environment, their resources cannot be accessed by other tenants. So while the importance of isolation is well understood, the strategies for realizing a robust and secure isolation model, it varies significantly based on the design of the SaaS application and the services it uses. So in this session, I'm going to dive in on some of the challenges with building serverless multi-tenant SaaS environments. And we're going to do that by, first off, looking at the core isolation concepts, then some authentication and authorization of users, how to do tenant onboarding, applying tenant identity and context on services, before finishing off with a look at how to isolate data between tenants. So part of the challenge of isolation in a multi-tenant SaaS solution is that there are multiple definitions of tenant isolation. So let's start off by looking at the most common ones. So every SaaS provider agrees on the importance and value of protecting and isolating tenant resources. But the question is, what is enough isolation? Typically, companies will think about isolation through a security and compliance lens, where isolation is based to create boundaries between resources to limit any exposure to cross-tenant access. And this is a key area of focus for isolation. But isolation is also implemented as part of addressing noisy neighbor and performance concerns. And this is another reason data for tenants might be isolated. Some of the pros with the silo isolation model are it can support challenging compliance models. With a dedicated environment, there's no potential of having a noisy neighbor. It also gives you a limited blast radius if there are outages. On the con side, we find scaling issues and service quotas if every tenant has their own silo. And the cost efficiency often associated with building SaaS more or less disappears if everyone is siloed. So on the pool model, then, some pros. The agility that comes with managing, scaling, and operating all of the tenants with one unified experience. And of course, the cost efficiency. And the cons, besides the previously mentioned complexity in both securing it and isolating, the more resources are shared, the more chances there are for one tenant to impact the experience of another one with a larger blast radius, and compliance pushback from customers due to sharing infrastructure. And while SaaS providers are often focused on the value of sharing resources, there are still scenarios where a SaaS provider may choose a model where tenants have dedicated resources for some or perhaps all of their environments. And we can use the full spectrum, from accounts to your virtual private networks, to your auto-scaling groups, to your instances, and so on, to isolate and secure your application. There are also more granular versions of silo models where storage or individual services of your application are siloed for specific tenants. And this strategy lets you then apply different isolation strategies based on the specific security and noisy neighbor considerations of individual services. And this more targeted approach, it often provides SaaS providers with a mix of approaches that more selectively addresses the needs of each resource that needs to be isolated. If you hear a dog in the background, well, it's my dog who wants to join the session. We'll see if he joins in even more later on. Many companies that are moving to SaaS seek out the efficiency, the agility, and cost benefits of being able to have their tenants share some or all of their underlying infrastructure. And this shared infrastructure approach, which is referred to as the pool model, it has a lot of upsides. You can imagine how placing tenants in shared infrastructure adds new levels of complexity to your tenant isolation models. And the key here is that even though there is more challenging environments to isolate and secure, you cannot use this as a rationale to relax the isolation requirements of your environment. If anything, this shared model increases the chance for cross-tenant access. And such, it represents an area that requires you to especially diligent about ensuring that resources are isolated. So the first part in securing your multi-tenant SaaS application is making sure that our users can authenticate and be authorized to perform the needed actions based on roles or others. And while it's expected that you will control access to your SaaS environments through authentication and authorization, getting beyond the entry points of a login screen or an API does not mean you have achieved isolation. So this is just one piece of the isolation and security puzzle. So let's jump into a demo to look at authentication and authorization. So Amazon Cognito lets you add users sign up and sign in to your mobile and web applications. So I've created a simple example of how we're able to sign up users, having them select different tiers and then have self sign up. In this case, I'm logging in as an example user. Now, this is built using a serverless application, and I'm using infrastructure as code, of course. And this is my Amazon Cognito user pool. And this is where I'm then storing my users for the application. This defines the schema for my user pool. And this is then the serverless API we're using that then requires this authorization that we get from Amazon Cognito. So let me show you in the developer tools. Now I'm going to sign in as my admin user. And this then gives me an authentication token. And this access token is what's then being used. Show it to you. Here we go. So this then contains the access token and an ID token that we're using to be able to authorize our users. This in turn then contains the information that allows us to assign our users to different groups, in this case, an admin group. It contains the name, it contains ID, and so on for our specific user. Next, just a second, there we go. In our front end, we are then importing the AWS Amplify Framework to be able to then use this token. So fetching that token and setting the user as authenticated. We're also fetching from the token the name of the user, the email, and that ID token. And with that ID token, we are then able to have our user sign in and then be authenticated towards using the Amplify framework and using Amazon Cognito. Right. So next, when we have the ability to then onboard or log in as a user, we then want to be able to onboard new tenants to our application. So next, I want to show you how we can then get tenants onboarded to our SaaS system. And onboarding is really one of the most foundational aspects of SaaS. This is where we create a footprint of how tenants and users will be represented in our system. So determining how tenants will be identified and conveyed as they flow through the moving parts of our SaaS architecture. A key part of the security and isolation process is to introduce the notion of what's called a Sas Identity. And we want to make a tight connection between our users who are able to log in and authorize and our tenants. And that creates this combined user and tenant SaaS identity that we can then flow through the various services of our system. This allows tenant context to be promoted to what we say a first-class construct, and it simplifies the implementation of services that need access to this context because they don't have to resolve tenant context as a separate step. So at the top of the diagram is the web application that provides the user interface for our onboarding and authentication flows. And this connects to the microservices using a simple API. And the API are various microservices needed to support these onboarding flows. So tenant registration is the orchestrator of the onboarding process. It invokes the user manager to then create users in Amazon Cognito to be able to log in as we did in the previous step, and to the tenant manager to create these different tenants. The authentication manager, it authenticates users using the user manager service. So let's have a look at that. So here, we want to bind tenant context to our users. And these are different attributes that we're adding to our users. So we have an attribute for the tenant ID, the SaaS tenant, the tier, the company name, and the role within that tenant. So we're adding those to our user pool. And then we create a DynamoDB table to store tenant information. We're using simple attributes with the tenant ID. And then we have an AWS Lambda function, a serverless function that then puts this tenant. So we're able to create a new tenant and create that in our DynamoDB table. And it also allows us to create an admin user for each tenant in Cognito. So let's have a look at that function. Well, let's have a look at the front end first, sorry. So here we're able to then take these tenants and show them in the admin interface. So logging in as an admin user again. And as an admin user, I can see the tenants. In this case, we have 2 tenants. Let's create a new one. Adding a company name, a user, and an email address. And I'm able to select a tier. Different tiers will then give us different isolation models. It is created. And what happens is in our DynamoDB table, the tenant is added. It receives a tenant ID. And this tenant ID is then part of that Sas identity. And in this case, our users are then, when they are added into our Cognito pool, they will then be tied to that Sas identity. So let's sign in as a different user, opening developer tools again. Let's have a look at the token. Right, so this is the token for that user. Let's decode it. Here we go. So looking in that token, we can see that we have the tenant ID added as an attribute for that specific user. We also have the company name of that tenant, and it belongs to a specific Cognito group for that tenant as well. So even though we're using the same Cognito user pool in this case, we're able to then separate our users using that. And if we check our action for logging in or for authenticating our users, we can then see that we're fetching this tenant ID from that token when the user is logging in. Let's have a look in the user pool as well to show it there. So this is the Amazon Cognito user pool. We have our user, the different users. In this case, and we can see also that we have groups. One group per tenant is created, and the users are then added to that specific group. And inside the user, we can see that custom tenant ID created. So this allows us to then have isolation between different customers. And using it this way means that when we have a shared user pool, the policies, they will be the same for all users. So for instance, policies in terms of password, in terms of MFA and things like that will be the same for everyone that's sharing that user pool. Right, switching to a newer version of the example. In this case, when we sign in, we are then able to add an account ID. And the account ID is something that would then allow us to separate the users having the same front-end application, but with separate SaaS tenants. If there is no match between the user and the account ID, of course, we're not able to log in. If the user provides the correct account ID and the username and password, they will then be authenticated. And having this way of logging in means that we're able to use the same front-end application for multiple tenants instead of separating them with different subdomains or with different more complex ways of separating our users. So they are all part of the same user pool. And our user is, see, go. So that was having one user pool. It means that we aren't able to isolate our users. We need to have a way to separate them in that user pool. Having multiple user pools means that we can have a greater level of isolation between customers. So when, for instance, we signed up an advanced tier user, we, in this case, were able to create a separate user pool for that user. And that tenant can then have their own policies. They can have greater isolation from the pooled users in the shared user pool. So it allows us for more customization per tenant. So next, when we have our users, our tenants onboarded, we have ways of separating them, either by having a shared user pool or by having isolated user pools. We can then go on to applying this tenant identity, which contains the user, the username, and the tenant ID, onto our services. So we made sure to be able to get our tenants onboarded, and with those elements in place, we can then think about how to build the services and functionality of our application in a multi-tenant fashion. And this means applying this tenant identity and the context with the services that we build. So this is a very basic diagram that highlights services and their interactions with other aspects of the architecture. So as part of implementing these services, we have to think about what must be done to apply multi-tenancy to these services, and if they are to be delivered using the silo or pool model. So these services will need to store data, log metrics, and acquire user identity, all with a multi-tenant awareness. So we have to think about how is this achieved and applied within these services. So let's introduce what's called multi-tenant data partitioning. We are back to our serverless application template, and this is a table for products. In this case, we have different attributes, one for the tenant ID and one for the product ID. We also set up a schema for how to be able to use this as a hash key and a range key. So creating this table, we are then able to add products to this DynamoDB table, and then simply use the product ID and the tenant ID that we fetch when users are logged in. And doing it this way means that we're able to have a shared DynamoDB table, but then split that into our different tenants. So let's have a look at the tenant ID for my logged in user. We have that there. And next, I'm going to add a product to our application. We don't have any products right now, since this user belongs to a tenant where there aren't any products. Looking at the function that fetches, we can see that we have what's called a key condition expression. When we're fetching items from our table, we can then set up an expression that makes sure that we're only able to fetch items that has the same tenant ID as my logged in user. So when I'm adding a new product to the table, let's just add some dummy data. And save that. It is, of course, visible for me. And checking the table, we can see that a new item has been added. And the tenant ID, of course, matches my tenant ID. And with these tenant IDs added, we can now have a look at the function for creating these. I'm going to make use of what's called the token manager. And the token manager is a basic functionality for taking the token that we receive through the API and then decode that to be able to get that tenant ID. So even though this is an authorized user, it is authorized to use the API, we want to make sure that the token that we receive in the API call is the same as the tenant ID that this logged in user has. So the token manager is a quick way to check that. Then we're returning that tenant ID and are able to use that when storing the item. So this is the JWKS file that we receive from Cognito, and that then contains keys that we're able to use to verify this token. Right, so if we instead switch back to our put products, we've used the token manager to verify the tenant ID. And we're then adding that into our table and putting it into the DynamoDB table using the doc client. So let's switch back to our application. I'm going to add a new user. Add that user to, let's say, the professional tier. There we go. With that user added, you can now see when we're creating a new user, the function for creating those, we once again make use of the token manager to confirm that token. And when we're creating the user, we're adding the tenant ID to make sure that the user is added to the correct tenant. We're adding it to Cognito, calling the Cognito SDK and adding that user. And the parameters, the attributes that we showed earlier on, they are then added to this user as well. So we are now able to make use of that Sas identity to be able to, first off, use the multi-tenant data partitioning to add the Sas identity data based on the tenant identifier supplied as part of that incoming request. With the API call, we have that token. And then to be able to use the security context to extract and apply tenant identity for our data partitioning scheme. So we're using that token, we're using the tenant ID to be able to store and then isolate in our services. So at this state, we've addressed many of the core elements of SaaS architecture. What we really haven't touched on yet, though, is tenant data isolation. So as a SaaS provider, you have to take every attempt to ensure that each tenant's resources are protected from any kind of cross-tenant access. And this is especially challenging when these tenants are sharing elements of their infrastructure. So in the example, we had a shared DynamoDB table. So if for some reason one tenant was able to access another tenant's environment, that should or could then represent a huge blow for any SaaS business. So to address this, we must move beyond basic authentication. We have to introduce different policies and access controls to ensure that we're doing everything we can to isolate and protect tenant environments. Even in SaaS environments where resources are not shared, we should always take extra measures to be sure that we minimize our exposure to cross-tenant access. So let's have a look at data isolation in practice. So we have a few items in our orders table. And these items are then stored there. In this case, I'm showing an example using a container running in AWS Fargate. And we're fetching orders using a simple function. And we are then using the credentials from our token as before to make sure that we have the correct access. And then we're using a key condition expression. In this case, tenant ID equals tenant ID. So we're using a DynamoDB helper in this case to be able to fetch our data from DynamoDB. We're doing a scan of the orders tables to fetch all orders. And with the help of that token manager, we are then able to scan this table and fetch all orders. So that's the functionality we have in place. Next, let's have a look at our orders function on the front end, where we're using that order scan API. So right now, I am logged in as one user. I can see a bunch of orders, 4 orders in the system. And as we can see, they then belong to 2 different tenants in this case. Having a look at my identity pool, we can see that we are using what's called an identity pool role attachment. So we're attaching a role to the identity pool. If a user is authenticated, they will then receive this role. And this role is then using an identity provider using the token that we've seen a couple of times. The role in question is here in our infrastructure as code. And this is the role, and this is the policy document that we have inline. So we are allowing our users to query, scan, put item, and delete items in DynamoDB. And with that policy in place to our table, we are then adding a condition. And this is the magic source of data using data isolation in a shared DynamoDB table. So we're adding a condition for the leading keys in DynamoDB that the identity from Cognito should contain this tenant ID. And by adding that, we're able to restrict what data is returned from DynamoDB. So let's use this user, add it to the tenants group, which then has that policy in place. And let's sign in as that user. Right, logged in as that user, which then contains that new policy. Opening up developer tools again. Go, you can see token. Right, so now we can see that we belong to that group. Let's find it. It is, there we go. So we can now see that role added. And once again, the role we added contains a policy that then restricts the access we have in DynamoDB based on the leading keys that they need to contain that tenant ID. So now, switching back to orders, we can see that previously we saw 4 orders. Now we only see 3 orders, or two, sorry. So with the help of adding that, we're able to restrict. So even though it is a scan that should return all items, it actually only returns, and it doesn't filter on it. It's not filtering on a specific tenant ID, and it's not querying for a specific tenant ID. So we can be sure that DynamoDB in this case will only return items where the tenant ID is the leading key. And this is a way to then have a shared infrastructure, in this case a DynamoDB table, but still making sure that tenants are not able to access data. Because using only a query that it should, say the tenant ID should be the same as the tenant ID of the token, well, it still means that you are potentially able to access other things. It's just that query that separates you from the other tenant's data. But using it this way, well, there is no way that you will be able to access that data, since it is denied by the policy, and DynamoDB won't return that to you. So quick look at how that actually looks. This is the policy condition that we had. So we're able to then set an action, in this case DynamoDB get item or DynamoDB query. We use scanned in the example, and then we've set a condition. If the DynamoDB leading keys, well, they have to equal the whatever we set. In this case, we used tenant ID, and it allows us to then restrict that access. If you're not using DynamoDB, for instance, using PostgreSQL instead, there is the option of using RLS, which stands for row level security. And then you're able to actually do something similar and then restrict it using tenant ID, in this case, equals current tenant ID. And it will only return that specific tenant ID to you. If you're using, say, Amazon S3 for object storage, well, you can use IAM tag policies for achieving data isolation. And different services have different ways of solving this. So there is perhaps a challenge there, and it is that no service, well, there is no universal isolation strategy. So you have to look at each and every service that you use, different data stores and so on, and find the specific way of performing this data isolation there. So different solutions for data isolation for different services. All right, so very quick look at building serverless SaaS and some of the challenges. So let me just walk you through some of the takeaways. Isolation really is a foundational element of SaaS, and every system that delivers a solution in a multi-tenant model should ensure that their system takes measures to ensure tenant resources are isolated. And while it's expected that you'll control access to your SaaS environments through authentication and authorization, getting beyond the entry points of a login screen or an API doesn't mean that you've achieved isolation. That's just one piece of the isolation puzzle, and on its own, it's really not enough. And make sure to know your service quotas. So if you're using a pool model or a silo model, well, it depends on how many services or how many instances, for instance, can you spin up for that specific service. And make sure to apply security at all layers. You should have it on all layers of your stack to make sure that your multi-tenant SaaS solution is as secure as possible. And finally, there is no universal isolation strategy. You have to find the strategy that works specifically for the service that you use. All right. If you want to learn more about SaaS and multi-tenancy, isolation, and security, I've gathered a bunch of different resources for you with several example reference architectures that you can simply spin up and try them out. Just scan the QR code that you see on screen now or enter grosch.link/SaaS. There are white papers, labs, videos, and a bunch of different sample codes for you, all on SaaS and all on multi-tenancy. And with that, I want to thank you for watching. We've looked at some of the pieces you need to think about when building a serverless multi-tenant SaaS architecture. So if you have any further questions or comments, do reach out to me on Twitter at Gunnar Grosch, as shown on screen, or please connect on LinkedIn. So thank you for
very
watching.
much, Gunnar. That was excellent stuff. So we do have a question. Justinas is in the chat saying, should we consider any performance issues while isolating, and are there strategies we can use to cope with that?
So one part of it is depending on the isolation model you use. So if you used shared resources, there might be performance issues. So quite common pattern is that we see companies use these different tiers. So for instance, I might sign up as a customer and have a premium tier, for instance. Certain services that have performance considerations when scaling, they might then be deployed in a silo model. And other services that don't have these considerations, they might be deployed in a pool or shared way. So think about how your services, the different services in your architecture, if there are considerations when scaling, it might be worth thinking about how to separate them in pool or ISO or silo model.
Great stuff. Thank you very much. So, folks, there is a live Zoom run, live Zoom call running for some Q&A. So, Gunnar, if you want to hit the link that I just put in our Zoom chat here, you can go over to the other Zoom room. You can meet some of our online attendees. If any of you all out there have any more questions, or you want to talk more about multi-tenancy, authentication, identity, all the kind of things that came up in that talk, please head on over there. Gunnar, thank you so much for taking the time to join and stream and share your insight and wisdom with us today. Thank you everyone for watching, whether you're out there in Vilnius or online. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in a few minutes. Thanks for watching, folks. Take it easy. See you shortly.